Hi, welcome back to this channel. Should you not listen to the Chapter 2, Part 4, I would suggest you to listen to it first. You can find the video in my playlist. Without further ado, shall we start? Let's enjoy yourself with the book, A Study of History by Arnold J. Toynbee. Chapter 2, Part 5, The Golden Mean. Enough and too much. We have now reached a point at which we can bring our present argument to a head.
We have ascertained that civilizations come to birth in environments that are unusually difficult and not unusually easy, and this has led us on to inquire whether or not this is an instance of some social law which may be expressed in the formula: the greater the challenge, the greater the stimulus. We have made a survey of the responses evoked by 5 types of stimulus: hard countries, new ground, blows, pressures, and penalizations, and in all 5 fields the result of our survey suggests the validity of the law. We have still, however, to determine whether its validity is absolute. If we increase the severity of the challenge ad infinitum, do we thereby ensure an infinite intensification of the stimulus and an infinite increase in the response when the challenge is successfully met? Or do we reach a point beyond which increasing severity produces diminishing returns? And, if we go beyond this point, do we reach a further point at which the challenge becomes so severe that the possibility of responding to it successfully disappears? In that case, the law would be that the most stimulating challenge is to be found in a mean between a deficiency of severity and an excess of it. Is there such a thing as an excessive challenge? We have not yet encountered an example of such, and there are several extreme cases of the operation of challenge and response which we have not yet mentioned. We have not yet cited the case of Venice, a city, built on piles driven into the mud banks of a salt lagoon, which has surpassed in wealth and power and glory all the cities built on terra firma in the fertile plain of the Po. Nor Holland, a country which has been actually salvaged from the sea, but yet has distinguished herself in history far above any other parcel of ground of equal area in the North European plain. Nor Switzerland, saddled with her portentous load of mountains. It might seem that the 3 hardest pieces of ground in Western Europe have stimulated their inhabitants to attain, along different lines, the highest level of social achievement that has as yet been attained by any peoples of Western Christendom. But there are other considerations. Extreme in degree though these 3 challenges are, they are limited in range to only one of the 2 realms which constitute the environment of any society. They are challenges of difficult ground, no doubt, but on the human side, blows, pressures, and penalizations, the severity of this physical situation has been not a challenge but a relief. It has shielded them from human ordeals to which their neighbors were exposed. Venice on her mud banks, insulated from the continent by her lagoons, was exempt from foreign military occupation for almost 1,000 years. 8101797. Holland, too, has more than once saved her vital centers by temporarily reversing the mechanism which keeps her in existence and opening the dikes. What a contrast to the histories of neighboring Lombardy and neighboring Flanders, the 2 habitual battlefields of Europe. It is, of course, easy enough to cite examples of communities that have failed to respond to particular challenges. That proves nothing, for almost every challenge that has eventually evoked a victorious response turns out, on inquiry, to have baffled or broken one respondent after another before the moment when, at the 100th or the 1,000th summons, the victor has entered the lists at last. Such is the notorious prodigality of nature, of which a host of examples spring to the mind. For instance, the physical challenge of the North European forest effectually baffled primitive man. Unequipped with implements for felling the forest trees and ignorant of how to turn the rich underlying soil to account by cultivation, even if he had been capable of clearing it of trees, primitive man in northern Europe simply avoided the forest and squatted on the sand dunes and chalk downs where his remains in the shape of dolmens, flint mines, and the like are now found, seeking out lands which his successors scorned as bad lands when the forest was falling to their axes. For primitive man, the challenge of the temperate forest was actually more formidable than that of the frozen tundras, and in North America his line of least resistance eventually led him poleward beyond the forest's northern fringe to find his destiny in creating the Eskimo culture in response to the challenge of the Arctic Circle. Yet primitive man's experience does not prove that the challenge of the North European forest was excessive in the sense of being beyond human power of effective response. For the barbarians who followed on his heels were able to make some impression with the aid of tools and techniques acquired, perhaps, from civilizations with which they were in touch, until, in the fullness of time, the pioneers of the Western and the Russian Orthodox civilization came and saw and conquered. In the 2nd century BC, the southern vanguard of the North European forest in the Po Valley had been subdued by Roman pioneers after having from time immemorial baffled the Romans' precursors. The Greek historian Polybius, who visited the country immediately after it had been opened up, draws a striking contrast between the inefficient and poverty-stricken life of Rome's Gallic predecessors, whose last survivors were then still living this life in the backwoods at the foot of the Alps, and the cheapness and plenty which prevailed in adjoining districts which Rome had taken in hand. A similar picture was often drawn in the early 19th century, contrasting the squalid failure of the Redskins with the bustling vitality of the Anglo-American pioneers in the prime Val forest of Kentucky or Ohio. When we turn from the physical to the human environment, we find the same. A challenge which has defeated one respondent is afterwards proved by the victorious response of some later competitor to be not insuperable. Let us consider, for example, the relation between the Hellenic society and the North European barbarians. The pressure here was reciprocal, of each on the other, but let us confine our attention to the pressure of the Hellenic society on the barbarians. As this civilization radiated deeper and deeper into the interior of the continent, one layer of barbarians after another was confronted with a question of life or death. Was it going to succumb to the impact of this potent alien force and suffer a disintegration of its own social fabric in order to become food for assimilation into the tissues of the Hellenic body social? Or was it going to resist assimilation and be enrolled, in virtue of its resistance, in the recalcitrant external proletariat of the Hellenic society, which would in due course be in at the death of that society and gorge itself on its corpse? In short, would it be the carcass or the vulture? This challenge was presented successively to the Celts and the Teutons. The Celts after a long struggle broke down, after which the Teutons responded with success. The breakdown of the Celts was impressive, because they had had a good start and had taken spectacular advantage of it to begin with. They were given their opportunity by an error of tactics on the part of the Etruscans. These Hittite converts to the culture of their Hellenic competitors in the opening up of the western Mediterranean were not content with securing their foothold on the west coast of Italy. Their pioneers rashly pushed inland across the Apennines and scattered far and wide over the basin of the Po. In this they overtaxed their strength, while stimulating the Celts to destroy them. The result was a furor Celticus that was sustained for about 2 centuries and carried Celtic avalanches not only over the Apennines into Rome, but also into Macedonia and Greece and eastwards into Anatolia, where they left their mark and their name as Galatians. Hannibal used the Celtic conquerors of the Po basin as allies, but they failed, and the furor Celticus stimulated the response of Roman imperialism. In their western Lebensraum from Rimini to Rhine and Tyne, as well as in their eastern outposts on Danube and Halys, the Celts were disintegrated, swallowed, and eventually digested by the Roman Empire. This disintegration of the Celtic layer of European barbarism exposed the Teutonic layer, which lay next behind it, to the same challenge. How must the prospects of the Teutons have appeared to a historian of the Augustan age, who recalled the complete destruction of an abortive furor Teutonicus by Marius and had watched Caesar throw Teutonic, Ariovistus' neck and crop out of Gaul? He would have foretold that the Teutons would go the way of the Celts, and would probably give much less trouble in the process, but he would have been wrong. The Roman frontier reached the Elbe for a moment only, to withdraw immediately to the Rhine-Danube line and to remain there, and, when a frontier between civilization and barbarism stands still, time always works in the barbarians' favor. The Teutons, unlike the Celts, were proof against assaults of the Hellenic culture, whether delivered by soldiers, traders, or missionaries. By the 5th century of the Christian era, when the Goths and Vandals were harrying the Peloponnese and holding Rome to ransom and occupying Gaul and Spain and Africa, it was abundantly plain that the Teutons had succeeded where the Celts had failed, and this was proof that, after all, the pressure of the Hellenic civilization was not so severe that a successful response to it was impossible. Again, the intrusion of Hellenism upon the Syriac world in the train of Alexander the Great presented a standing challenge to the Syriac society. Was it, or was it not, to rise up against the intrusive civilization and cast it out? Confronted with this challenge, the Syriac society made a number of attempts to respond, and these attempts all had one common feature. In every instance, the anti-Hellenic reaction took a religious movement for its vehicle. Nevertheless, there was a fundamental difference between the first 4 of these reactions and the last one. The Zoroastrian, the Jewish, the Nestorian, and the Monophysite reactions were failures. The Islamic reaction was a success. The Zoroastrian and Jewish reactions were attempts to combat the ascendancy of Hellenism with the aid of religions already rife in the Syriac world before the Hellenic intrusion. In the strength of Zoroastrianism, the Iranians in the eastern domain of the Syriac civilization rose up against Hellenism and expelled it, within 2 centuries of Alexander's death, from all the region east of the Euphrates. At that point, however, the Zoroastrian reaction reached its limit and the remnant of Alexander's conquests was salvaged for Hellenism by Rome. Nor did the Jewish reaction under the Maccabees succeed in its more audacious attempt to liberate the western homeland of the Syriac civilization, within sight of the Mediterranean, by an uprising from within. The momentary triumph over the Seleucids was avenged by Rome. In the Great Romano-Jewish War of 66–70, the Jewish community in Palestine was ground to powder, and the abomination of desolation, which the Maccabees had once cast out from the Holy of Holies, came back to stay when Hadrian planted on the site of Jerusalem the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina. As for the Nestorian and Monophysite reactions, they were alternative attempts at turning against Hellenism a weapon which the intruding civilization had forged for itself from a blend of Hellenic and Syriac metal. In the syncretistic religion of primitive Christianity, the essence of the Syriac religious spirit had been Hellenized to a degree which rendered it congenial to Hellenic and uncongenial to Syriac souls. The Nestorian and Monophysite heresies were both of them attempts to de-Hellenize Christianity, and both of them failed as reactions against the Hellenic intrusion. Nestorianism was ignominiously driven out eastward beyond the Euphrates. Monophysitism held its ground in Syria and Egypt and Armenia by winning the hearts of a never Hellenized peasantry. But it was never able to wean away from orthodoxy and Hellenism a dominant minority inside the city walls. A Greek contemporary of the Emperor Heraclius who had witnessed the victory of the East Roman Empire in its last trial of strength with the Persian Sassanids and the victory of the Orthodox Christian hierarchy in its last trial of strength with Nestorian and Monophysite heretics, might have been betrayed, about the year 630 of the Christian era, into giving thanks to God for having made the earthly trinity of Rome, Catholicism and Hellenism invincible. Yet at this very moment the fifth Syriac reaction against Hellenism was impending. The Emperor Heraclius himself was condemned not to taste of death until he had seen Umar, the successor of Muhammad the Prophet, coming into his kingdom to undo, utterly and forever, the work of all the Hellenizers of Syriac domains from Alexander onwards. For Islam succeeded where its predecessors had failed. It completed the eviction of Hellenism from the Syriac world. It reintegrated, in the Arab Caliphate, the Syriac universal state which Alexander had ruthlessly cut short, before its mission had been fulfilled, when he overthrew the Persian Achaemenid. Finally, Islam endowed the Syriac society, at last, with an indigenous universal church and thereby enabled it, after centuries of suspended animation, to give up the ghost in the assurance that it would not now pass away without leaving offspring. For the Islamic Church became the chrysalis out of which the new Arabic and Iranic civilizations were in due course to emerge. The foregoing examples indicate that we have not yet hit upon the right method for dealing with the problem now before us, which is to find an unequivocal instance in which a challenge has been proved to be excessive. We must approach the problem on other lines. Comparisons in 3 terms: a new approach to the problem. Can we find some alternative method of search that promises better results? Let us try the effect of starting our inquiry from the opposite end. Hitherto we have started with a challenge that has defeated a respondent. Let us now start from instances in which a challenge has administered an effective stimulus and provoked a successful response. In the various sections of the previous chapter we have examined many instances of this kind and have compared the example of successful response with parallel cases in which the same party, or a comparable party, responded with less success to the same, or a comparable, challenge when the challenge was less severe. Let us now reconsider some of these comparisons between 2 terms and see whether we can increase our 2 terms to 3. Let us look in each case for some third historical situation in which the challenge has been not less severe but more severe than in the situation from which we have started. If we succeed in finding a third term of this kind, then the situation from which we have started, that of the successful response, becomes a middle term between 2 extremes. At these 2 extremes the severity of the challenge is respectively less and greater than at the mean. What about the success of the response? In the situation where the challenge was less, we have already found that the response was less. But what about the third situation, which we are now introducing for the first time? Here, where the severity of the challenge is at its highest, shall we find that the success of the response is at its highest also? Suppose that we find, on the contrary, that an increase in the severity of the challenge beyond the mean degree is not accompanied by any increase in the success of the response, but that, on the contrary, the response declines. If this proves to be so, we shall have found that the interaction of challenge and response is subject to a law of diminishing returns. We shall conclude that there is a mean range of severity at which the stimulus is at its highest, and we will call this degree the optimum, as contrasted with the maximum. Norway, Iceland, Greenland. We have already found that it was in Iceland, and not in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, that the abortive Scandinavian civilization achieved its greatest triumphs both in literature and in politics. The achievement was a response to a twofold stimulus, the stimulus of overseas migration and the stimulus of a bleaker and barrener country than that which these Scandinavian seafarers had left behind. Now suppose the same challenge had been repeated with redoubled severity. Suppose the Norsemen had travelled 500 miles on and settled in a country as much bleaker than Iceland as Iceland is bleaker than Norway. Would this Thule beyond Thule have bred a Scandinavian community twice as brilliant in literature and politics as that of Iceland? The question is not hypothetical, for the conditions which we have postulated were actually fulfilled when the Scandinavian seafarers pushed on to Greenland. And the answer to the question is not in doubt. The Greenland settlement proved a failure. Over a span of little less than half a millennium, the Greenlanders were being slowly worsted in a tragic losing battle against a physical environment which was too severe even for them. Dixie, Massachusetts, Maine. We have already compared the severity of the physical challenge presented by the harsh climate and stony soil of New England with the less severe challenge presented by Virginia and the Carolinas to the British American colonists, and have shown how, in the struggle for the control of the continent, it was the New Englanders who outdistanced all their rivals. Evidently, the Mason and Dixon line roughly corresponds with the southern limit of an area of optimum challenge. We have now to ask ourselves whether this area of highest climatic stimulus has another limit on the northern side, and as soon as we have framed the question we are aware that the answer is obviously affirmative. The northern limit of the optimum climatic area actually partitions New England. For, when we speak of New England and the part it has played in American history, we are really thinking of only 3 of its 6 little states, of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and not of New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Massachusetts has always been one of the leading English-speaking communities of the North American continent. In the 18th century she took a leading part in resistance to the British colonial regime and, in spite of the immense development of the United States since that time, Massachusetts has maintained her position in the intellectual sphere and to some extent in the industrial and commercial spheres as well. Maine, on the other hand, though actually a part of Massachusetts until her establishment as a separate state in 1820, has always been unimportant, and survives today as a kind of museum piece, a relic of 17th-century New England inhabited by woodmen and watermen and hunters. These children of a hard country now eke out their scanty livelihood by serving as guides for pleasure seekers who come from the North American cities to spend their holidays in this Arcadian state, just because Maine is still what she was when many of these cities had not yet begun to arise out of the wilderness. Maine today is at once one of the longest settled regions of the American Union and one of the less urbanized and sophisticated. How is this contrast between Maine and Massachusetts to be explained? It would appear that the hardness of the New England environment, which stands at its optimum in Massachusetts, is accentuated in Maine to a degree at which it brings in diminishing returns of human response. And, if we carry our survey still farther north, we are confirmed in this surmise. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island are the least prosperous and progressive provinces of the Dominion of Canada. Farther north again, Newfoundland has in recent years been compelled to abandon an unequal struggle to stand on her own feet and has accepted a thinly veiled form of Crown colony government in return for assistance from Great Britain. Farther north again, in Labrador, we reach conditions such as confronted the Norse settlers in Greenland, a maximum challenge which, far from being optimum, might more truly be described as pessimum. Brazil, La Plata, Patagonia, the Atlantic seaboard of South America obviously presents parallel phenomena. In Brazil, for example, the greater part of the national wealth, equipment, population, and energy is concentrated in the small fraction of this vast territory which lies south of the 20th degree of southern latitude. Moreover, southern Brazil itself is inferior in civilization to regions farther south, on either side of the La Plata estuary, the Republic of Uruguay and the Argentinian state of Buenos Aires. It is evident that, along the South American Atlantic seaboard, the equatorial sector is not stimulating but positively relaxing. But there is also evidence that the more stimulating temperate climate of the Rio de la Plata estuary is an optimum. For if we follow the coast farther south again we shall find an increase of pressure, no doubt, but a decline of response as we traverse the bleak plateau of Patagonia. If we choose to go still farther we shall fare still worse, for we shall find ourselves among the numbed and starved savages who just managed to creep alive among the frosts and snows of Tierra del Fuego. Galloway, Ulster, Appalachia. Let us next consider an instance in which the challenge has been not exclusively physical but partly physical and partly human. At the present day, there is a notorious contrast between Ulster and the rest of Ireland. While Southern Ireland is a rather old-fashioned agricultural country, Ulster is one of the busiest workshops in the modern Western world. Belfast ranks with Glasgow, Newcastle, Hamburg, or Detroit, and the modern Ulsterman has as great a reputation for being efficient as he has for being unaccommodating. In response to what challenge has the Ulsterman made himself what he now is? He has responded to the dual challenge of migrating across the sea from Scotland and of contending, after his arrival in Ulster, with the native Irish inhabitants whom he found in possession and proceeded to dispossess. This twofold ordeal has had a stimulating effect which may be measured by comparing the power and wealth of Ulster at the present day with the relatively modest circumstances of those districts on the Scottish side of the border between Scotland and England and along the lowland fringe of the Highland line, from which the original Scottish settlers in Ulster were recruited at the beginning of the 17th century. The modern Ulster men, however, are not the only surviving overseas representatives of this stock, for the Scottish pioneers who migrated to Ulster begot Scotch-Irish descendants who re-emigrated in the 18th century from Ulster to North America, and these survive today in the fastnesses of the Appalachian Mountains, a highland zone which runs through half a dozen states of the American Union from Pennsylvania to Georgia. What has been the effect of this second transplantation? In the 17th century, the subjects of King James crossed St. George's Channel and took to fighting the wild Irish instead of the wild Highlanders. In the 18th century, their great-grandchildren crossed the Atlantic to become Indian fighters in the American backwoods. Obviously, this American challenge has been more formidable than the Irish challenge in both its aspects, physical and human. Has the increased challenge evoked an increased response? If we compare the Ulsterman and the Appalachian of today, 2 centuries after they parted company, we shall find that the answer is once again in the negative. The modern Appalachian has not only not improved on the Ulsterman, he has failed to hold his ground and has gone downhill in a most disconcerting fashion. In fact, the Appalachian mountain people today are no better than barbarians. They have relapsed into illiteracy and witchcraft. They suffer from poverty, squalor, and ill health. They are the American counterparts of the latter-day white barbarians of the Old World, Rifais, Albanians, Kurds, Pathans, and hairy Ainus. But, whereas these latter are belated survivals of an ancient barbarism, the Appalachians present the melancholy spectacle of a people who have acquired civilization and then lost it. Reactions to the ravages of war in the Ulster-Appalachia case, the challenge was both physical and human, but the operation of the law of diminishing returns appears quite as clearly in other instances in which the challenge is presented in the human sphere exclusively. Consider, for example, the effects of the challenge presented by devastation in war. We have already recorded 2 cases in which severe challenges of this kind met with triumphant responses. Athens responded to the devastation of the Persian invasion by becoming the education of Hellas, and Prussia responded to the devastation of the Napoleonic invasion by becoming the Germany of Bismarck. Can we find a challenge of this kind which proved too severe, a devastation whose wounds festered and in the long run proved mortal? We can. The devastation of Italy by Hannibal did not, like those other less searing visitations, turn out to have been a blessing in disguise. The devastated arable lands of southern Italy were transformed partly into pasturelands and partly into vineyards and olive orchards, and the new rural economy, planting and stockbreeding alike, was worked by slave labor in place of the free peasantry which had once tilled the soil before Hannibal's soldiers burnt the peasant's cottage and before weeds and briars invaded his deserted fields. This revolutionary change from subsistence farming to cash crop farming and from husbandry to the application of servile manpower undoubtedly increased for a time the monetary value of the produce of the land. But this was more than offset by the social evils it entailed, the depopulation of the countryside and the congregation of a pauper proletariat of ex-peasants in the towns. The attempt to arrest these evils by legislation, made by the Gracchi in the 3rd generation after Hannibal's evacuation of Italy, only aggravated the distemper of the Roman Commonwealth by precipitating a political revolution without bringing the economic revolution to a halt. Political strife became inflamed into civil war, and, 100 years after the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus, the Romans acquiesced in the establishment of the permanent dictatorship of Augustus as a drastic remedy for a desperate state of affairs. Thus the devastation of Italy by Hannibal, so far from stimulating the Roman people as Xerxes' devastation of Attica had once stimulated the Athenians, actually gave them a shock from which they never recovered. The chastisement of devastation, which had proved stimulating when administered with Persian vigor, became deadly when inflicted with Punic intensity. Chinese reactions to the challenge of emigration. We have compared already the effects of varying degrees of physical challenge on different groups of British emigrants. Let us now consider the reaction of Chinese emigrants to varying degrees of human challenge. When the Chinese coolie emigrates to British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, he is apt to reap a reward for his enterprise. By facing the social ordeal of leaving his familiar home and entering an alien social environment, he exchanges an economic environment in which he is innovated by age-long social traditions for one in which he is stimulated to better himself, and not infrequently he makes his fortune. Suppose, however, that we intensify the social ordeal which is the price of economic opportunity. Suppose that, instead of sending him to Malaya or Indonesia, we send him to Australia or California. In these white man's countries our enterprising coolie, if he gains admission at all, will undergo an ordeal of vastly greater severity. Instead of merely finding himself a stranger in a strange land, he will have to endure deliberate penalization in which the law itself will discriminate against him instead of coming to his aid as it does in Malaya, where an official protector of Chinese is appointed by a benevolent colonial administration. Does this severer social ordeal evoke an economic response of proportionately greater vigor? It does not, as we can see if we compare the levels of prosperity which are in fact attained by the Chinese in Malaya and Indonesia with the levels attained by immigrants of the same gifted race in Australia and California. Slavs, Achaeans, Teutons, Celts. Let us next reconsider the challenge which a civilization presents to a barbarism, a challenge that has been presented in Europe to successive layers of barbarians in successive ages by the radiation of various civilizations into the interior of this once dark continent. When we study this drama, our attention is caught by one instance in which the challenge has evoked a response of extraordinary brilliance. The Hellenic civilization is perhaps the finest flower of the species that has ever yet come to bloom, and it was generated, in response to a challenge from the Minoan civilization, by European barbarians. When the maritime Minoan civilization established a footing on the Greek peninsula, the Achaean barbarians of the hinterland were neither exterminated nor subjected nor assimilated. Instead, they managed to retain their identity as an external proletariat of the Minoan thalassocracy without failing to learn the arts of the civilization which they were holding at bay. In due course they took to the sea, overwhelmed the thalassocrats on their own element and became thereafter the true fathers of the Hellenic civilization. The Achaean claim to the paternity of Hellenism is vindicated, as we have seen already, by a religious test, for the gods of the Olympian pantheon manifestly display in their lineaments their derivation from Achaean barbarism, while any vestiges of a Hellenic church derived from the Minoan world are only to be found, if at all, in the side chapels and crypts of the temple of Hellenic religion, in certain local cults, subterranean mysteries, and esoteric creeds. The measure of the stimulus in this instance is given by the brilliance of Hellenism. But we can measure it in another way by comparing the fortunes of this Achaean layer of barbarians with the fortunes of another layer which happened to be so remote and sheltered that it remained virtually immune from the radiation of any civilization whatever for 2,000 years after the Achaeans had received the Minoan challenge and made their brilliant response. These were the Slavs, who had ensconced themselves in the Pripyat marshes when these dregs of the continent had been yielded up to man by the retreating ice cap. Here they went on living the primitive life of European barbarism century after century, and, when the Teutonic Volkerwanderung ended the long Hellenic drama which the Achaean Volkerwanderung had begun, there these Slavs still were. At this late hour of the European barbarians' day, the Slavs were at last routed out of their fastness by the nomad Avars, who had been tempted to stray beyond the limits of their native Eurasian steppe in order to take a hand in the Teutons' game of pillaging and wrecking the Roman Empire. In the strange environment of an agricultural world, these lost children of the steppe sought to adapt their old manner of life to their new circumstances. On the steppe, the Avars had made their living as herdsmen of cattle. In the cultivated lands on which they had now trespassed, these herdsmen found that the appropriate local livestock was a human peasantry, and they therefore set themselves, rationally enough, to become herdsmen of human beings. Just as they would have raided their nomadic neighbors' cattle in order to stock some newly conquered pastureland, so they now looked round for a human breed of cattle to restock the depopulated provinces of the Roman Empire that had fallen into their hands. They found what they wanted in the Slavs, herded them into droves, and stationed them in a vast circle round the Hungarian plain on which they pitched their own camp. This, it appears, was the process by which the western vanguard of the Slav host, the forefathers of the present Czechs, Slovaks, and Jugoslavs, made their belated and humiliating debut in history. This contrast between the Achaeans and the Slavs shows that, For a primitive society, complete immunity from the challenge of encounters with civilizations is a very serious handicap. It shows, in fact, that this challenge has a stimulating effect when its severity is of a certain degree. But suppose that we accentuate the challenge. Suppose that we raise the degree of energy which the Minoan society radiated to higher potencies. Shall we thereby elicit a response even more brilliant than that of the Achaean fathers of Hellenism? Or will the law of diminishing returns again come into play? On this point we need not speculate in a void, for between the Achaeans and the Slavs there have lain several other layers of barbarians who have been exposed to the radiation of various civilizations in various degrees. What became of them? One instance in which European barbarians have succumbed to a radiation of destructive intensity has come to our notice already. We have seen how the Celts were eventually exterminated or subjected or assimilated after a transitory outburst of energy in response to a stimulus which the Celts had received through the medium of the Etruscans. We have contrasted the ultimate failure of the Celts with the relative success of the Teutons in holding their own against the Hellenic impact. We have noted that the Teutonic layer of European barbarians, unlike the Celtic layer, resisted the disintegrating action of Hellenism to such effect that the Teutons were able to take their place in the external proletariat of the Hellenic world and to dispatch the Hellenic society in its death agonies with the coup de grace. By comparison with the Celtic debacle, this Teutonic reaction was a success, but as soon as we compare the Teutonic achievement with the Achaean, we are reminded that the Teutons won nothing better than a Pyrrhic victory. They came in at the death of the Hellenic society only to receive their own death blow, on the spot, from the rival proletarian heirs of the defunct society. The victor on this field was not the Teutonic warband but the Roman Catholic Church into which the internal proletariat of the Hellenic society had incorporated itself. Before the close of the 7th century of the Christian era, every one of those Arian or heathen Teutonic warbands that had ventured to trespass on Roman ground had been either converted to Catholicism or wiped out of existence. The new civilization, affiliated to the Hellenic, was related to its predecessor through the internal and not through the external proletariat. Western Christendom was essentially the creation of the Catholic Church, in contrast to Hellenism, which was essentially the creation of the Achaean barbarians. Let us now arrange our present series of challenges in the order of an ascending scale of severity. The Slavs were long immune from the challenge altogether and were patently the worse for being without the stimulus. The Achaeans received what, to judge from their response, must be regarded as the optimum challenge. The Teutons held their own against the challenge of the Hellenic civilization, but were subsequently worsted by the challenge of Catholicism. The Celts, encountering the Hellenic society in its prime, in contrast to the Teutons, who encountered it in its decline, were overwhelmed by it. The Slavs and the Celts experienced the extremes, an insipid immunity on the one hand and an overwhelming bombardment on the other. The Achaeans and the Teutons occupy the position of middle terms in a comparison which, this time, contains 4 terms instead of 3, but the mean in the sense of the optimum experience was that of the Achaeans. 2 abortive civilizations, the rearguard of the Teutonic Völkerwanderung. Is it possible to define more closely the point at which the law of diminishing returns is brought into play in the series of challenges between radiating civilizations and European barbarians? It is, for there are 2 examples which we have not yet taken into account. These are the conflict between the Roman Church, as parent of our Western society, and the abortive far Western Christendom of the Celtic fringe, and the conflict between our Western society in its early stages and the far northern or Scandinavian society of the Vikings. In both these conflicts the antagonist was a barbarian rearguard, which had always remained beyond the range of Roman rule and had held itself in reserve at the time when the Teutonic vanguard was plunging its sword into the dying body of the Hellenic society, to destroy and, as it turned out, to be destroyed. Moreover, both these rearguards achieved a degree of success which, while falling short of that of the Achaeans, greatly surpassed that of the Teutons, who come next below the Achaeans in our 4-term comparison as at present stated. The Achaeans succeeded in producing a great civilization supplanting the Minoan civilization which they attacked. The Teutonic vanguard enjoyed a transitory good time in the congenial orgy of destruction, but achieved nothing, or almost nothing, of positive value. The far Western Christians and the far Northern Vikings, on the other hand, each got as far as begetting a civilization, but in each case the Embiro succumbed to a challenge which proved too strong for it. We have already referred by implication more than once to the existence of abortive civilizations which we did not include in our original list because the essence of a civilization is to be found in its achievement of maturity, whereas these are victims of infant mortality. The course of our argument now presents an opportunity for examining two of them. The abortive far Western Christian civilization, the Celtic fringe, reacted to Christianity in a way that was all its own. Unlike the Gothic converts to Arianism or the Anglo-Saxon converts to Catholicism, these Celts did not take the alien religion as they happened to find it. Instead of allowing it to break up their native tradition, they molded it to fit their own barbarian social heritage. No other race, says Renaud, showed such originality in its way of taking Christianity. Perhaps we can discern this even in the reactions of the Christianized Celts of Britain under Roman rule. We know very little about them, but we know that they produced, in Pelagius, a heresiarch who made a stir throughout the Christian world of his day. More important in the long run than Pelagianism, however, was the work of Pelagius's fellow countryman and contemporary Patrick, who carried Christianity beyond the frontier of the Roman world to Ireland. The English transmarine Volkerwanderung, which dealt the British Celts a crushing blow, made the Irish Celts' fortune. Its effect was to segregate Ireland, in the period immediately after the seeds of Christianity had been sown there, from those former Roman provinces in Western Europe in which a new Christian civilization, oriented towards Rome, was developing. It was this segregation, at the most formative stage of early growth, that made it possible for the embryo of a separate and distinctive far Western Christian society, with its nucleus in Ireland, to emerge simultaneously with the emergence of the nascent continental Western Christendom. The originality of this far Western Christendom is manifest alike in its ecclesiastical organization, in its ritual and hagiography, and in its literature and art. Within 100 years of St. Patrick's mission, the Irish Church had not only developed its distinctive features but had in many respects shot ahead of continental Catholicism. This is proved by the warmth of the welcome which, when the period of segregation was over, Irish missionaries and scholars received in Britain and on the continent, and by the eagerness with which British and continental students sought out the Irish schools. The period of Irish cultural superiority extends from the date of the foundation of the monastic university at Clonmacnoise in Ireland in 548 to the foundation of the Irish monastery of St. James at Ratisbon in 1090. But this transmission of culture was not the only social consequence of the renewal of contact between insular and continental Christendom. Another consequence was a contest for power. The issue at stake was whether the future civilization of Western Europe should derive from an Irish or from a Roman embryo, and on this issue the Irish were defeated long before they lost their cultural ascendancy. The struggle was brought to a head in the 7th century by a competition between the disciples of St. Augustine of Canterbury and those of St. Columba of Iona for the conversion of the Angles of Northumbria, the dramatic encounter of their representatives at the Synod of Whitby 664, and the Northumbrian king's decision in favour of St. Wilfrid, the champion of Rome. The Roman victory was clinched almost immediately when Theodore of Tarsus came over from the continent as Archbishop of Canterbury to organise the Church in England on the Roman diocesan system with metropolitan sees at Canterbury and York. In the course of the next half-century, all the communities of the Celtic fringe, Picts, Irish, Welsh and Bretons, and lastly Iona itself, accepted the Roman tonsure and the Roman method of calculating the date of Easter, which had been the points formerly in dispute at Whitby. But there were other differences which did not entirely disappear until the 12th century. From the time of the Synod of Whitby onwards, the far Western civilization was isolated and doomed. It suffered severely from the Viking raids on Ireland in the 9th century of the Christian era, when not a single Irish monastery escaped pillage. So far as is known, not a single work in Latin was written in Ireland in the 9th century, though at this very time the scholarship of the Irish refugees on the continent stood at its zenith. The Scandinavian challenge, which was literally the making of England and France because it stimulated the English and French peoples to the optimum degree, presented itself to Ireland in her renewed isolation with such excessive severity that she could win no more than a Pyrrhic victory, the defeat of the invaders by Brian Boru at Clontarf. The final blow was the opening of the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland by the Angevin king Henry II, with a papal blessing, in the middle of the 12th century. Instead of founding a new civilization of their own, it was the fate of the spiritual pioneers of the Celtic fringe to be laid under contribution by the very competitors who were robbing them of their birthright of independent creation. Irish scholarship was made to minister to the progress of the continental Western civilization when Irish scholars, fleeing from Ireland as refugees from Scandinavian onslaughts, were enlisted in the service of the Carolingian Renaissance, in which Johannes Scotus Erigena, the Irish Hellenist, philosopher and theologian, was undoubtedly the greatest figure. The abortive Scandinavian civilization, it will be seen that, in the contest between Rome and Ireland for the privilege of becoming the creator of the new Western civilization, Rome only just succeeded in gaining the upper hand. And while the nascent Western Christendom was still in its infancy, it had to engage, after the briefest breathing space, in a second struggle for the same prize, this time in conflict with the Teutonic rearguard of the North European barbarians which had been holding itself in reserve in Scandinavia. This time the circumstances were more formidable. The trial was made on the military as well as on the cultural plane, and the two contending parties were severally stronger and also more alien from one another than the rival Irish and Roman embryos of a future Western Christendom had found themselves 2 centuries earlier. The histories of the Scandinavians and of the Irish, before their respective contests with Western Christendom began, run parallel to this extent, that both had enjoyed a period of isolation from their future antagonist. The Irish Christians had been isolated by the irruption of Anglo-Saxon pagans into England. The Scandinavians were isolated from Roman Christendom before the end of the 6th century of the Christian era by the interposition of the pagan Slavs who drifted overland along the southern shores of the Baltic from the line of the Niemen to the line of the Elbe. Into the vacuum left by the emigration of the Teutonic barbarians who had evacuated this region because they had been involved in the post-Hellenic Völkerwanderung while the Scandinavians had stayed at home. Thus the Irish found themselves isolated from their fellow Christians and the Scandinavians from their fellow Teutons by wedges of more barbarous interlopers. There was, however, a fundamental difference. Whilst the previous radiation out of the Roman Empire had kindled among the Irish, before the Anglo-Saxon eruption, a spark of Christianity which burst into flame during the period of isolation, the Scandinavians remained pagans. The Scandinavian Völkerwanderung, like other Völkerwanderungen, was the reaction of a barbarian society to the impact of a civilization, in this case embodied in Charlemagne's empire. This empire proved a fiasco because it was both grandiose and premature. It was an ambitious political superstructure piled up recklessly on rudimentary social and economic foundations, and the arch-instance of its unsoundness was the tour de force of Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony. When Charlemagne set out in 772 to bring Saxony within the fold of Roman Christendom by military conquest, he was making a disastrous breach with a policy of peaceful penetration, conducted by Irish and English missionaries for a century past, which had effectively extended the borders of Christendom by converting the Bavarians, Thuringians, Hessians, and Frisians. The ordeal of the Franco-Saxon 30 Years' War overstrained the weak tissues of the nascent Western society and aroused in the souls of the Scandinavians the same furor barbaricus that had once been awakened in the souls of the Celts when the ambitious expansion of the Etruscans came to a halt at the foot of the Alps. The Scandinavian expansion in the 8th to 11th centuries after Christ surpassed the Celtic expansion of the 5th to 3rd centuries BC both in extension and in intensity. The abortive envelopment of the Hellenic world by the Celts, which had carried their right wing into the heart of Spain and their left wing into the heart of Asia Minor, was dwarfed by the operations of the Vikings, who threatened Orthodox as well as Western Christendom by extending their left wing into Russia and their right into North America. Again, the two Christian civilizations were in greater jeopardy when the Vikings were attempting to force their way along the Thames, the Seine, and the Bosphorus past London, Paris and Constantinople than was the Hellenic civilization when the Sacs were momentarily masters of Rome and Macedonia. Again, the abortive Scandinavian civilization which began to unfold itself in Iceland before its chill beauty was melted into formlessness by the warm breath of Christianity, far surpassed in both achievement and promise the rudimentary Celtic culture, relics of which have been discovered by modern archaeologists. It is of the nature of the method pursued in this study that the same historical events should recur in different contexts. We have already described the challenge presented by the Scandinavian invasions to the peoples of England and France and shown that they rose victoriously to that challenge by achieving their own unity and, still more, by converting the Scandinavian settlers and incorporating them into their own civilization. Just as, after the doom of the Celtic Christian culture, its sons contributed to the enrichment of Roman Christendom, so the Normans became the spearhead of Latin aggression 2 centuries later. Indeed, a historian has described the First Crusade, in a vivid oxymoron, as a Christianized Viking expedition. We have also described the significance of Iceland in the life of the abortive Scandinavian civilization and speculated on the strange results that might have followed if the Scandinavian pagans had equaled the achievement of the Achaeans and, driving Christianity underground, had established throughout Western Europe their own pagan culture as the one and only successor of the Hellenic civilization in that area. We have still to glance at the conquest and extinction of the Scandinavian civilization in its own homelands. This conquest was achieved by a reversion to the tactics which Charlemagne had discarded. The self-defense of Western Christendom had been conducted, perforce, on military lines, but, as soon as the militant Western defensive had brought the militant Scandinavian offensive to a halt, the Westerners resumed the tactics of peaceful penetration. After converting, and thus seducing from their original allegiance, the Scandinavian settlers in Western Christian lands, Western Christendom applied the same tactics to the Scandinavians who had remained at home. And at this point, one of the outstanding virtues of the Scandinavians assisted in their undoing, their remarkable receptivity, a characteristic noticed by a contemporary Western Christian scholar and expressed by him in a couple of rather bad hexameters. They take over the customs and language of those who join their standards, so that the result is a single race. It is curious, for example, to find that Scandinavian rulers, even before their conversion to Christianity, made a hero out of Charlemagne and showed an inclination to name their sons Carlos or Magnus. If in the same generation Muhammad and Umar had become favorite Christian names among the rulers of Western Christendom, we should certainly have concluded that this new fashion boded ill for the prospects of Western Christendom in its struggle with Islam. In the Scandinavian kingdoms of Russia, Denmark, and Norway, the formal outward act of conversion to Christianity was imposed upon the people wholesale by the arbitrary fiat of 3 Scandinavian princes who reigned contemporaneously near the end of the 10th century. In Norway, there was at first a strenuous resistance, but in Denmark and Russia the change was accepted with apparent passivity. Thus the Scandinavian society was riot-only conquered but was partitioned, for Orthodox Christendom, which had borne its share of the Viking onslaught, shared also in the religious and cultural counteroffensive which followed. The ambassadors or merchants of Russia compared the idolatry of the woods with the elegant superstition of Constantinople. They had gazed with admiration on the dome of St. Sophia, the lively pictures of saints and martyrs, the riches of the altar, the number and vestments of the priests, the pomp and order of the ceremonies. They were edified by the alternate succession of devout silence and harmonious song, nor was it difficult to persuade them that a choir of angels descended each day from heaven to join in the devotion of the Christians. The conversion of Iceland itself followed almost immediately in the year 1000, and it was the beginning of the end of the Icelandic culture. It is true that the subsequent Icelandic scholars who committed the sagas to writing, collected the Edda poems and made the classic digests of Scandinavian mythology, genealogy, and lore were all endowed with a Christian as well as a northern cultural heritage. They did their work some 150 to 250 years after the conversion. But this backward-looking scholarship was the last feat of the Icelandic genius. We may contrast the role of the Homeric poems in Hellenic history. These also were a work of backward-looking scholarship, in that they were not given literary form by Homer until after the heroic age which had inspired them was over. But the Hellenic genius, having achieved the epics, passed on to further achievements of equal magnitude in other fields, whereas the Icelandic achievement petered out after reaching its Homeric peak about 150–1250. The impact of Islam on the Scandinavians. To conclude this part of our inquiry, let us see whether the impacts of Islam upon the Christendoms will furnish yet another of those comparisons in 3 terms with which the reader is by this time familiar. We have already noticed in another connection a challenge from Islam which evoked an optimum response. The challenge presented to the Franks in the 8th century of the Christian era evoked a counteroffensive extending over many centuries which not only drove the adherents of Islam out of the Iberian Peninsula but also, traveling on beyond its original objective, carried the Spaniards and Portuguese overseas to all the continents of the world. In this case, too, we may notice a phenomenon which we have already observed in considering the defeat of the far Western and Scandinavian civilizations. Before it was entirely rooted out and destroyed, the Iberian Muslim culture was exploited for the benefit of its victorious antagonist. The scholars of Muslim Spain contributed unintentionally to the philosophical edifice erected by the medieval Western Christian schoolmen, and some of the works of the Hellenic philosopher Aristotle first reached the Western Christian world through Arabic translations. It is also true that many Oriental influences on Western culture which have been attributed to infiltration through the Crusaders' principalities in Syria really came from Muslim Iberia. The Muslim attack on Western Christendom through Iberia and over the Pyrenees was not really as formidable as it looked, owing to the length of the line of communications between this front and the fountainheads of Islamic energy in southwestern Asia, and it is not difficult to find a quarter in which the lines of communication were shorter and the Muslim attack proved in consequence too severe. This region is Anatolia, at that time the citadel of the Orthodox Christian civilization. In the first phase of their attack, the Arab aggressors sought to put Rum out of action and to overwhelm Orthodox Christendom altogether, by striking right across Anatolia at the imperial city itself. Constantinople was unsuccessfully besieged by the Muslims in 673–7 and again in 717–18. Even after the failure of the second siege, when the frontier between the two powers settled down along the line of the Taurus Mountains, what remained of the Anatolian domain of Orthodox Christendom was regularly raided by the Muslims twice a year. The Orthodox Christians responded to this pressure by a political expedient, and this response was successful on a short view, inasmuch as it availed to keep the Arabs at bay. On a long view, on the other hand, it was unfortunate on account of its pernicious effects on the inward life and growth of the Orthodox Christian society. The expedient was the evocation of a ghost of the Roman Empire in the Orthodox Christian world by Leo the Syrian, about 2 generations before the same feat was attempted unsuccessfully by Charlemagne in the West. The most disastrous effect of Leo the Syrian's achievement was the aggrandizement of the Byzantine state, at the expense of the Orthodox Church, and the consequent internecine 100 Years' War between the Eastern Roman Empire and Patriarchate on the one side and the Bulgarian Empire and Patriarchate on the other. This self-inflicted wound was the death of the Orthodox Christian society in its original form and its original home. These facts suffice to show that the challenge presented by the Islamic impact to Orthodox Christendom, unlike its challenge to Western Christendom, was excessive. Can we find a case in which the Islamic impact failed to stimulate through being insufficiently severe? We can, for the results are to be seen to this day in Abyssinia. The Monophysite Christian community which has survived in this African fastness has become one of the social curiosities of the world. First, on account of its sheer survival, in almost complete isolation from other Christian communities, ever since the Muslim Arabs conquered Egypt 13 centuries ago, and secondly on account of its extraordinarily low cultural level. Though Christian Abyssinia was admitted, with some hesitation, to membership in the League of Nations, she was a byword for disorder and barbarism, the disorder of feudal and tribal anarchy and the barbarism of the slave trade. In fact, the spectacle presented by the one African state, apart from Liberia, that had retained its complete independence was perhaps the best justification that could be found for the partitioning of the rest of Africa among the European powers. Consideration shows that the peculiarities of Abyssinia, the survival of her independence and the stagnation of her culture, both derive from the same cause, the virtual impregnability of the highland fastness in which this fossil is ensconced. The wave of Islam and the mightier wave of our modern Western civilization have washed round the foot of the escarpment and momentarily broken over its crest without ever permanently submerging the summit. The occasions on which these hostile waves have swept up onto the highlands have been few and brief. Abyssinia was in danger of Muslim conquest in the first half of the 16th century, when the Muslim inhabitants of the lowlands on the Red Sea coast forestalled the Abyssinians in the acquisition of firearms. But the newfangled weapons which the Somalis had acquired from the Osmanlis reached the Abyssinians from the Portuguese just in time to save them from destruction. Thereafter, when the Portuguese had served their turn and begun to make themselves a nuisance by trying to convert the Abyssinians from monophysitism to Catholicism, the Western version of Christianity was suppressed and all Western visitors were expelled from the country in the 1630s, at the same time as a similar policy was being carried out by Japan. The British Abyssinian expedition of 1868 proved a complete success but was without ulterior consequences, unlike the opening of Japan by the American Navy 15 years earlier. However, at the time of the scramble for Africa in the last years of the 19th century, some European power was bound to tackle Abyssinia, and the Italians made the attempt. This time the part played by the Portuguese 2.5 centuries before was played by the French, who supplied the Emperor Menelik with breech-loading rifles which enabled him to inflict a resounding defeat on the Italian invader at Adowa in 1896. When the Italians, malignantly fortified by the deliberate cultivation of a neo-barbarism in themselves, returned to the charge with greater resolution in 1935, it looked for the moment as though they had succeeded in putting an end to the ancient impregnability of Abyssinia as well as to the newborn promise of collective security for a tormented Western world. But within 4 years of the proclamation of an Italian empire of Ethiopia, Mussolini's intervention in the General War of 1939–45 had impelled the British, who had refrained from coming to Abyssinia's assistance in 1935–6 for the sake of saving the League of Nations, to save their own skins in 1941–2 by performing for Abyssinia, after all, the same obliging service that the French and the Portuguese had performed for her in previous emergencies. These 4 foreign attacks are all that Abyssinia has had to face during the 16 centuries since her adoption of Christianity, and the first 3, at any rate, were repelled too quickly to be stimulating. Otherwise her experience has been a blank, and might serve as a refutation of the saying that the nation is happy which has no history. Her record contains little but monotonous and meaningless violence against a background of apathy, a word which, in the original Greek, means invulnerability to the pains of experience or, in other words, imperviousness to its stimulus. In 1946, Notwithstanding the valiant efforts at reform that were then being made by the Emperor Haile Selassie and his band of liberal-minded lieutenants, it remained to be seen whether the fourth foreign attack on Abyssinia would have any more stimulating effect than its predecessors.
End of Chapter 2, Part 5. Should you want to continue to Chapter 3, Part 1, please proceed to the next video. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you.